Chinese mythology, a concise guide to the gods, heroes, sagas, rituals, and beliefs of Chinese myths. Written by Bernard Hayes. Narrated by Zachary Dillon Brown.
David Hume. Understanding His Philosophical Works and Life by Ferdinand Gyves. Narrated by Alistair Cunningham. Contents: David Hume Biography, Childhood and Early Life, Career, Major Works, Personal Life and Legacy, David Hume Gossip, Introduction to the work of David Hume, David Hume's greatness as a philosopher, David Hume's impressions and ideas. David Hume is a skeptic. Hume, an intellectual biography. David Hume's quotes. Science quotes by David Hume. David Hume biography. David Hume was a Scottish philosopher, historian, and essayist, known for his radical philosophical skepticism and empiricism. It is because of this he is placed amongst the likes of John Locke, Francis Bacon, George Berkeley, and Thomas Hobbes. Hume is remembered for his influential system of radical philosophical empiricism, skepticism, and naturalism. Hume intently believed that passion rather than reason governed human behavior, and that human knowledge was solely based on human experience. Sadly, Hume gained fame much later in his life, his works having been appreciated and considered of immense value only posthumously. Hume began his literary journey with his masterpiece, A Treatise of Human Nature. Though the book was widely dismissed and written off by the critics of the time, it is today considered one of the most important works on the history of Western philosophy. Hume found success only later in life, when he became an essayist. His job as a librarian in the University of Edinburgh helped him access a trove of research materials, which provided him with the guided information for his massive 6-volume masterpiece, The History of England. The book earned favourable response and became a bestseller. It was considered as a standard history of England during its time. It is for this reason, amongst others, he is considered as a pivotal figure in the history of philosophical thought. Childhood and Early Life. David Hume was born on April 26, 1711, in Edinburgh, Scotland, to Joseph Home and the Honourable Catherine Falconer. He was the second of the 2 sons born to the couple. Young Home's father died when he was barely 2 years old. He was single-handedly raised by his mother. In 1734, Home changed his surname to Hume, as Home was little known in England. At the age of 12, Hume attended the University of Edinburgh. This was unusual, considering the standard age for admission during those days was 14. Hume considered a career in law, but found his real calling in philosophy and general learning. As a result, he never graduated. Career. At the age of 18, Hume made a philosophical discovery that opened a new scene of thought for him. Such was the influence of the thought over him that he gave up everything to pursue it. Though no one actually knows what the new scene of thought was, many have interpreted their own variations. Inspired by the new thought, Hume spent more than 10 years reading and writing on the subject. He reached a stage wherein he was on the verge of a mental breakdown. Just as when he had decided to come out of his shell and have an active social life, Hume was afflicted with a ravenous appetite and palpitations of the heart. It took him some time to become sturdy and robust. Despite having a noble background, Hume had very limited means for livelihood, as well as little to no formal education. As such, he set forth to Bristol, wherein he apprenticed as an assistant to a rich merchant. Hume's apprenticeship did not last long, as he soon retired to La Flèche in Anjou, France. After about 4 years in France, Hume came up with his first work, a treatise of human nature, subtitled Being an Attempt to Introduce the Experimental Method of Reasoning into Moral Subjects, in 1738. The treatise was Hume's attempt to formulate a full-fledged philosophical system. The book, treatise, was divided into 3 subparts, while the book of the Understanding discussed the origin of ideas of space, time, knowledge, and probability, while Book 2, of the Passions, described elaborate psychological machinery to explain the affective or emotional order in humans. Book 3, on Morals, characterized moral goodness in terms of feelings of approval or disapproval that people have when they consider human behavior in the light of agreeable or disagreeable consequences. Treatise was by and large Hume's most ambitious work. He had great expectations from the book, which however turned otherwise with its failure, as it did not even excite a murmur. Although today considered one of the most important books on Western philosophy, Treatise was waved off as abstract and unintelligible by critics of the time. Hume had exhausted his savings while writing the treatise in France, and had yet again become a man with limited means. However, he did not let his financial status or poor reception come in the way of his future study and works. He soon studied with double the vigour and came up with a pamphlet, an abstract of the book. It was a document that contained summaries of the main doctrines of the treatise. In 1744, Hume published Essays, Moral and Political. The book was well received, and a later edition of the book, entitled Essays, Moral, Political and Literary, was also published. Following his book, Hume applied for the chair of pneumatics and moral philosophy at the University of Edinburgh. His application was however rejected, as he was an atheist. For the next few years, Hume wandered aimlessly. For a year, he served as a tutor to the Marquis of Annandale. He spent a few months as secretary to General James St. Clair, wandered in London and at Ninewells for some time, and later returned to spend a couple of months with General St. Clair on an embassy to the courts of Vienna and Turin. While serving General James St. Clair, Hume penned Philosophical Essays Concerning Human Understanding, which was later published as An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. Often called the First Inquiry, it was more successful than his first book, Treatise. In 1751, having failed to obtain a chair in philosophy at the University of Glasgow, Hume accepted the post of a librarian offered to him by the Faculty of Advocates. Though the job did not pay him well, it nevertheless gave Hume an exposure to a large library. Simultaneously, while serving as a librarian, Hume continued his research on his ambitious project, The History of England. Expanding to 6 volumes between 1754 and 1762, The History of England was hugely successful. The volumes covered events right from the invasion of Julius Caesar to the Revolution of 1688. The book took more than 15 years to finish and ran more than 1 million words. The History of England was a bestseller and brought Hume the fame that he so well deserved. It gave him financial independence and built his reputation as a gifted writer. Despite being suppressed by family and friends, Hume continued to write controversial work on religion. He came up with 2 substantially debatable works, the Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion and the Natural History of Religion. Though the Dialogues wasn't published until 1779, posthumously, the Natural History appeared in 1757 along with his new essay, 4 Dissertations. In 1763, Hume was invited to attend Lord Hertford in Paris. Consequently, he was offered a position as a private secretary to the British ambassador to France, which he readily accepted. During his 3 years of stay, Hume became a secretary to the embassy and later its charge d'affaires. He became popular and gained company of famous European intellectuals. In 1767, Hume was appointed Under-Secretary of State for the Northern Department. He served in the position for 2 years. In 1769, he returned to James Court in Edinburgh, where he built a house in Edinburgh's New Town. He lived there from 1771 until his death in 1776. He spent considerable time revising his works for new editions of his essays and treatises, which contained his collected essays, the 2 inquiries, a dissertation on the passions, and the natural history of religion. Amongst his last works, his autobiography takes up a prominent place. He composed a brief autobiography titled My Own Life. Having less than 5 pages, the book notably contains interesting judgments that were of interest to readers of Hume. Though the book lacked amusing anecdotes or startling revelations, it threw light on his love for literary life and his passion for writing. Before his death, Hume prepared for the posthumous publication of his book, The Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. Major works. Given the fact that Hume was one of the most controversial writers of his age, it can be expected that his works were greatly scrutinized and inspected. He achieved literary success with his massive 6-volume literary work, The History of England, which became a bestseller and remained the standard history of England in its time. Though he espoused his debut work, Treatise of Human Nature, as juvenile, today the work is considered as Hume's most important literary piece. It records Hume's strongest and most important arguments, and most philosophically distinctive doctrines. It is regarded as one of the most important works in the history of Western philosophy. Personal life and legacy. Hume never married in his lifetime. He spent considerable time with his family in Ninewells, Berwickshire. In 1775, Hume was diagnosed with intestinal cancer. He breathed his last on August the 25th, 1776. As desired by him, his body was interred in a simple Roman tomb on the southwestern slope of Calton Hill, in the old Calton Cemetery. He requested in his will that his tomb be inscribed only with his name and year of birth and death. David Hume gossip. David Hume never married, but that doesn't mean he was completely unfamiliar with the ladies. Au contraire. He didn't always make the wisest choices, though. For example, he had a thing with a certain Marie-Charlotte Hippolyte de Campe de Saujon, Comtesse de Boufflers. There were several problems here, and not just with remembering her name. For one thing, Madame Boufflers was already married, and to a count no less. For another thing, Madame Boufflers was also someone else's mistress, and that someone else was a prince. The lack of a wife did not stop Hume from fathering the occasional child. Okay, it was only one child, and it was an accusation that was never proven. In any case, Hume left Scotland before the child was born, and the woman, Agnes Galbraith, appeared in sackcloth. Hume's first book, A Treatise of Human Nature, received little attention when it was first published. As a result of the few reviews that did come out of it, Hume famously declared that the book fell deadborn from the press. Finally, though, in 1740, an anonymous writer published a positive and very detailed account of that very treatise of human nature. Who was the writer? It turns out very likely to have been none other than David Hume. As they say, the only way to be sure a job gets done right is to do it yourself. Hume's reputation was slow to develop, especially in the English-speaking world. And that bugged him. It really, really bugged him. But Hume decided that that was his audience's problem. He declared that the banks of the Thames were inhabited by barbarians. Barbarians are known to have the worst taste in philosophy. Did Hume, The notorious atheist and enemy of religion repent on his deathbed. James Boswell paid him a visit towards the end, desperately hoping that the answer would be yes, but he found Hume to be more emphatic than ever in his anti-religious views, insisting on the mortality of his own soul. That was just too much for poor Boswell, who claimed to have been later plagued by nightmares about the encounter. Introduction to the work of David Hume. In the introduction to his Treatise of Human Nature, David Hume, 1711 to 1776, describes the intellectual scene before him as a noise and clamour, in which every trivial question was debated, but nothing important ever settled. Hence arose a common prejudice against metaphysical reasoning of all kinds, even among those who profess themselves scholars. Thinkers such as Descartes, Locke, and Berkeley had apparently succeeded in undermining the basis of our basic beliefs about the world, but had not succeeded in erecting anything substantial in their place. Hume is rightly counted among the great philosophical skeptics, yet his primary aim is not destructive. His philosophical project, as he saw it, was to establish a new foundation for philosophy on the ground cleared by skepticism. The foundation was to be provided by a new science of human nature, based on experience and observation. The full title of the first book is A Treatise of Human Nature, being an attempt to introduce the experimental method of reasoning into moral subjects. For Hume, the science of human nature was like a capital city from which, once captured, we might extend our conquest over all those sciences which concern human life. He describes his method as experimental, and he sees himself as applying the methods of Isaac Newton and Francis Bacon to moral subjects. However, since these subjects are not susceptible to controlled experiments, Hume urges that we must clean up our experiments in this science from a cautious observation of human life, and take them as they appear in the common course of the world, by men's behaviour in company, in affairs, and in their pleasures. Experience and observation, according to Hume, were the only basis of the moral sciences, as for the natural sciences, and he refused to draw any conclusion that could not be confirmed by them. Human nature and causation. Hume begins from our perceptions, the basic elements of human experience. These divide into impressions, which comprehend all our senses, passions, and emotions, as they make their first appearance in the soul, and ideas, which are the faint images of these impressions in thinking and reasoning. Ideas are built up out of impressions, but they are not always straightforward reproductions, for we can imagine things we have never experienced from the materials provided by our impressions, such as flying donkeys or streets paved with gold. Some ideas, such as space, time, the existence of external objects themselves, and causation, are held universally and are fundamental to our understanding of the world. Yet, Hume argues these ideas are not furnished by our senses and reason alone. Hume's skeptical attack on the idea of causation is especially well known. Reason can only provide certain knowledge regarding the necessary relations of ideas, as in the derivation of mathematical truths. If we know the definitions of 2 and plus, reason can tell us that 2 plus 2 is 4. Causation, however, is an empirical matter, and therefore is not subject to this kind of conceptual certainty. While we cannot imagine 2 plus 2 amounting to anything but 4, we can imagine an object unaccompanied by its cause. Therefore, it is not reason alone that provides the idea of causation. Nor, Hume argues, do we ever directly experience causation. Our senses can tell us that two objects are contiguous in space and time, and that one follows the other. However, our senses never glimpse the necessary connection of causation. How, then, do we arrive at the idea of causation? According to Hume, we form this idea through imagination and experience. Although we can never experience one object causing another, we do experience certain objects consistently following on others, or constant conjunction. These experiences give rise to an expectation that certain objects will continue to follow one another in the future, and this eventually coalesces, in our imagination, into the idea of a necessary connection between cause and effect. Hume thus restores what his critique dissolved, but puts it on a new foundation. Rather than the certainty of reason or sense data, causation, and our ideas of time, space, continuing selves, and external objects is a product of the imagination, an uncertain faculty that is seemingly so trivial and so little founded on reason, working upon experience. Since causation arises from the operation of our imagination, we are not warranted in attributing to it the world outside of our perceptions. Causation is something that exists in the mind, not in the object. In spite of this view, Hume maintains that life and action entirely depend on believing in causation, and that our nature is such that we cannot help but believe it. Causation, selves, and external objects are fictions, but they are fictions without which we could not live. Morality. Much moral philosophy aims at explaining what behaviour is moral, and why we ought to be moral. Hume, by contrast, assumes from the outset that human beings have a functional capacity to make moral judgments and use moral ideas such as virtue, vice, duty, obligation, and blame in a way that makes sense. Moreover, he observes we are motivated to act on these judgments. Hume's moral philosophy is aimed less at determining which acts are virtuous and which vicious than at discovering how we can come to make moral judgments. As in his analysis of causation, Hume eliminates both the senses and reason as possible sources of moral judgment. Although we possess moral ideas, virtue, vice, etc., these qualities are not detectable by sense. He asks the reader to consider a case of vicious murder, and see if you can find that matter of fact or real existence which you call vice. In whichever way you take it, you find only certain passions, motives, volitions, and thoughts. The vice entirely escapes you as long as you consider the object. You never can find it till you turn your reflection into your own breast and find a sentiment of disapprobation which arises in you towards this action. Morality, says Hume, lies in yourself, not the object. Nor are our moral ideas the result of reason. Reason seeks truth or falsehood, but does not produce volition. At best, reason helps us to satisfy the passions that we already have. Hence, Hume famously argues that reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions, and can never pretend into any other office than to serve and obey them. Moral ideas, by contrast, evoke passions and motivate actions. We find morally evil acts repugnant, and are guided by ideas of moral obligation. Our moral ideas, Hume concludes, cannot be the product of reason. The moral sentiments not only distinguish morality from reason, but define morality itself. Morality, says Hume, is more properly felt than judged of. An act is virtuous because it evokes a particular and pleasurable sentiment of approbation. Vicious acts are those that inspire painful disapprobation. According to Hume, moral judgments are made based on the sentiments that arise in us in response to acts and individuals. From where do these sentiments arise? According to Hume, humans have a natural capacity, called sympathy, to communicate and share our sentiments. When we imagine that another is experiencing a certain passion, the same sentiment is evoked in our own mind. Seeing others happy makes us happy via sympathy. This capacity is variable. We sympathize more strongly with those close to us, or those who resemble us, but we can also take up a general point of view that can correct for our partiality. Taking up this point of view, we come to admire those traits that we conclude are useful to those who possess them and those who surround them. For example, the sense of benevolence as a virtue arises as follows. Benevolent acts bring happiness to people, and the happiness of the beneficiaries, through sympathy, produces happiness in those who witness or imagine these acts. As the connection between benevolence and happiness is reinforced by experience, we come to feel a sense of moral approbation for the trait of benevolence as tending to produce good. Hume calls natural virtues, those qualities such as generosity, benevolence, and good judgment, which are always useful for those who possess them or those who surround them, and are therefore everywhere admired. Hume also speaks of artificial virtues, such as justice, which is obedience to the rules governing the possession and exchange of property. Individual acts of justice may be contrary to the public good, and conversely, individual acts of injustice, stealing from a rich rascal to feed poor children, for example, may seem to produce more happiness. Yet obedience to the rules of justice commands nearly universal moral approbation. How is this so? Moral sentiments operate at a removal from the immediate consequences of an action. Artificial virtues are those that are useful, but only when they are part of a general scheme or system of action which is advantageous. While natural sympathy and generosity can regulate social relations in very small groups, they are insufficient when society reaches a certain size and complexity, because our partiality for ourselves, and even those closest to us, creates a desire to acquire goods for ourselves and our friends, even if we must dispossess others to do so. This is the major source of conflict that the rules of justice are designed to solve. While individuals' short-term good may be served by injustice, everyone's long-term interests are best served by a stable system of property. As people see the benefits of these just conventions and develop the habit of obeying them, they begin to admire justice as a virtue. Artificial virtues are artifacts created by human beings in response to the circumstances and necessities of mankind. For Hume, moral distinctions are rooted neither in divine authority nor in reason, but in our sentiments formed by experience and habit. In his dialogues concerning natural religion, published posthumously and anonymously, Hume produced a series of discussions that explored the possibility of natural knowledge of God and his attributes. The root of our moral ideas is interest, putting our sympathetic interest in the happiness of others. But always following our interests would not lead to reliably moral behavior. Over time, habit causes moral sentiments of approbation to attach to certain intentions and character traits, such as generosity and justice, serving to reinforce the commitment to morality and making social life possible. To some, this analysis might seem to undermine morality, but Hume believes that nothing can be more real or concern us more than our own sentiments of pleasure and uneasiness. Our educated passions are a more reliable support for morality than perfectly inert reason could possibly be. Politics. Hume discussed both current and fundamental political and economic matters in his various essays written from the 1740s onwards. Notable amongst these are essays on liberty, political parties, the question of whether politics can be reduced to a science, and on money, credit, and taxes. The economic essays argue against mercantilism, and the political essays support caution and moderation. Hume's essay, Of the Original Contract, provides a good sense of his overall political stance. His main target is the theory of the social contract, supported by the English Whigs, which holds that governmental authority rests on consent of the governed. According to this view, government results from a contract in which the ruled consent, either explicitly or tacitly, to the authority of the rulers in exchange for justice and protection. If the rulers fail to provide these things, they void their authority and license rebellion. Hume believes that this theory is repugnant to all the common sentiments of mankind and to the practice and opinions of all nations and all ages. No existing government has been founded by a universal act of consent, and yet, everywhere, human beings believe that they owe allegiance to their government. Indeed, the notion of consent does not enter the minds of subjects who suppose themselves born under obligations of obedience to a certain sovereign, nor of princes who claim their subjects as their property and assert their independent right of sovereignty from conquest or succession. Allegiance is seen as a duty, and only those trained in the theory of the social contract imagine this duty to be founded on consent. This theory is dangerous, because it too readily grants a right of rebellion that destabilizes political society. A second theory, upheld by the English Tories, underwrites the legitimacy of the sovereign, not by consent, but by divine origin, arguing that rebellion is never justified, because divine sanction obliges subjects to obey the sovereign. But if God is indeed the origin of all events, we cannot use divine origin to distinguish the good governments from the bad. Moreover, the notion of passive obedience goes too far. In extraordinary cases, when public ruin would evidently attend obedience, the safety of the people takes precedence over the authority of the governors. Hume argues that nearly everyone in all times and places have believed that the people are justified in resisting cruel tyrants, such as Nero. The foundation of government is not consent or force, but rather it is an opinion only that the government is founded. Government is grounded on people's opinions that they have a duty to obey. Whence this opinion? The duty of allegiance, like the rules of justice, is a human artifact designed to solve such a problem. As seen above, the rules of justice originate as a set of conventions aimed at preventing conflicts that arise from property disputes. Yet, such is the fragility or perverseness of our nature, it is impossible to keep men, faithfully and unerringly, in the paths of justice. Short-term interests served by injustice often overpower long-term interests in justice. To alleviate this problem, magistrates are invested with the power to enforce just rules. Over time, habit soon consolidates what other principles of human nature have imperfectly founded, and men, once accustomed to obedience, never think of departing from that path. We need justice because our natural generosity is not enough to sustain society, and we need government as a mechanism to reinforce justice. The moral commitment to obedience, in turn, buttresses the legitimacy of government. While Hume allows that in extreme cases rebellion would be justified, he would draw the bond of allegiance very close. Because the very existence of society depends on the historical development of shared opinions, Hume is suspicious of rapid reform. It is not with forms of government, as with other artificial contrivances, where an old engine may be rejected if we can discover another, more accurate and commodious. An established government has an infinite advantage by that very circumstance of being established. The bulk of mankind being governed by authority, not reason, and never attributing authority to anything that has not the recommendation of antiquity. Hume's moral outlook grounds a conservative suspicion of rapid, philosophically motivated change. For him, the wise magistrate, though he may attempt some improvements for the public good, yet will he adjust his innovations as much as possible to the ancient fabric. David Hume's greatness as a philosopher. Though Hume's greatness as a philosopher has never been questioned, Hume's exact place in the history of philosophy has remained a matter of dispute. Hume is the most consistent empiricist and carries out in his philosophy the skeptical consequences which logically follow from the findings of Locke and Berkeley. Exposed to Hume's criticism, the world of knowledge which Locke had so laboriously constructed disappears altogether and disintegrates into separate and disconnected elements, among which there is no bond of union, no principle of organization. Berkeley has criticized the material substance of Locke, but, inconsistently to his empirical position, he maintains spiritual substances to be real. Hume, in his turn, shows the unreality of the spiritual substance as well, and reduces both the material and spiritual world into a series of loose, disconnected, and discrete sensations. So, given Locke's premises, there remains in the final conclusion nothing substantial, systematic, or necessary, but merely the fleeting impressions of the moment. The philosophy of Hume is the last word of empiricism. Here, reason is employed to show the weakness of reason, and reason is turned against itself. This is the traditional interpretation of Hume's empiricism. But it was Kemp Smith who exposed the baselessness of this criticism against Hume. Hume never wanted to demolish metaphysics like Locke. He also gave much importance to epistemological discussions in philosophy. Hume analysed the contents of human understanding to show that the human mind is not fitted for such abstruse subjects like metaphysics. In fact, Hume wanted to lay the foundation of true metaphysics, as distinguished from false and spurious metaphysics. As Bertrand Russell observes, we can see the traces of rationalism, empiricism, phenomenalism, and even linguistic philosophy in his writings. David Hume's Impressions and Ideas. Section 2 of Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding introduces Hume's basic empiricistic principle, viz., the principle that all our ideas, or more feeble perceptions, are copies of our impressions, or more lively ones. Following the same method as Locke, Hume analysed human knowledge into its constituents, and finds that perceptions, i.e. mental states, may be divided into two classes, viz. Impressions and ideas. The difference between them consists in the degrees of force and liveliness with which they strike upon the mind. Those which enter into mind with more force and violence we may name impressions. By ideas I mean the faint images of these in thinking and reasoning. The word idea was already in use, but Hume uses it in a definite sense, defined it, and has introduced a new word, impression, while defining idea. The distinction between impressions and ideas is given now in psychological terms, so that the distinction is verifiable in immediate experience. The distinction lies in degrees of vivacity, liveliness, or intensity. Ideas are defined by Hume as copies of impressions. By the term impression, I mean all our more lively perceptions, when we hear, or see, or feel, or love, or hate, or will. Inquiry. When we receive a red object, we have an impression of red, and when the object is removed from my sight, or I close my eyes, I still have a faint image of red in my mind. This is the idea of red. Thus, an idea is an image or copy of the corresponding impression. According to Hume, we cannot form an idea without a previous impression. A blind man cannot form the idea of red, because he has not the previous impression or perception of red. Hume applies his view on mental experiences also. He who hasn't had the direct experience of pain cannot have the idea of pain. He who has not felt hatred can never have the idea of hatred. There is considerable difference between an idea and an impression. The most lively thought, idea, is still inferior to the dullest sensation. By the term impression, Hume means all our more lively experiences, when we hear, or see, or feel, or love, or hate, or desire, or will. And impressions are distinguished from ideas, which are less lively perceptions, of which we are conscious when we reflect on those sensations. All the materials of thinking are derived either from our outward or inward sensations. All our ideas, or more feeble perceptions, are copies of our impressions, or more lively ones. Hume proves this by two arguments. First, when we analyse our thoughts, or ideas, however sublime or complex, we always find that they resolve themselves into such simple ideas as were copied from a precedent feeling or sentiment. When we think of a golden mountain, we only join two ideas, gold and mountain, with which we were acquainted before. We form the idea of God as an infinitely intelligent, wise, powerful, and benevolent personality. Our experience of different moral qualities are infinitely stretched or expanded by our imagination. The creative power of the mind amounts to no more than the faculty of compounding, augmenting, or diminishing the materials afforded to us by the senses. In short, all the materials of thinking are derived from either our outward or inward sensations. The mixture and composition of these belongs alone to the mind and the will. Secondly, if a man, from a defect of an organ, is not able to have that particular sensation, we always find he is unable to have the correspondent ideas. A deaf man can form no idea of sound, just as a blind man can form no idea of colour. So, Hume's conclusion is, no impressions, no ideas. There is, however, one contradictory phenomenon, which may prove that it is not absolutely impossible for ideas to arise independent of their correspondent impression. Suppose a person is perfectly acquainted with colours of all kinds, except one particular shade of blue, for instance. Is it possible for him to form the idea of that shade from his imagination? Hume says that he can form the idea of that particular missing shade of blue, but this instance is for Hume so singular that it cannot alter his general maxim: no impressions, no ideas. All ideas, especially abstract ones, are naturally faint and obscure. The mind has but a slender hold of them. On the contrary, all impressions, that is, all sensations, either outward or inward, are strong and vivid. They are not exactly determined, nor is it easy to fall into any error or mistake in regard to them. Here then we have, Hume suggests, a method by which many philosophical difficulties might be solved. When we entertain any suspicion that a philosophical term is employed without any meaning or idea, as is but too frequent, we need but inquire from what impression is that supposed idea derived, and if it be impossible to get any, this will serve to confirm our suspicions. The relation of ideas and impressions is one of derivation of one from the other. Ultimately, all our ideas are derived from impressions, and are only copies of our impressions. At first sight, it may appear that the mind has an unbounded liberty in the formation of ideas, that it can form ideas of things of which we have never had any impression. But when carefully examined, it is found that such ideas can always be analysed into elements with which we have always been acquainted by way of impression. Hume thus avoids the inconsistencies of both Locke and Berkeley. Locke had proposed to start with nothing but ideas, yet, for him, each idea carries with it an account of its origin, and presented as a quality of some real thing. For Berkeley, it is the universal mind which is the background of all our ideas. But the real background of ideas or perceptions, whether material, as with Locke, or theological, as with Berkeley, is simply wiped out by Hume in his theory. The difference between impressions and ideas is so evident that there is no scope of any confusion between them. The actual outer or inner sensations may be termed impressions, the weaker images of memory or imagination which they leave behind them, ideas. Hume uses these words to distinguish the impressions from ideas. Impressions are strong, forceful, lively, and vivacious. Contrastingly, ideas are weak, less forceful, less lively, and less clear. The feeblest impression is never confused with the strongest idea. The difference is not only a difference of degree, but they seem to be qualitatively different too. Since nothing can gain entrance to the soul, except through outer and inner sensation, there is no idea which has not arisen from an impression, or several of such. Every idea is an image and copy of an impression. David Hume is a skeptic. David Hume is the most consistent empiricist, and carries out in his philosophy the skeptical consequences which logically follow from the findings of Locke and Berkeley. Exposed to Hume's criticism, the world of knowledge which Locke has so laboriously constructed disappears altogether and disintegrates into separate and disconnected elements, among which there is no bond of union, no principle of organization. Berkeley has criticized the material substance of Locke, but, inconsistently to his empirical position, he has maintained spiritual substances to be real. Hume, in his turn, shows the unreality of the spiritual substance as well, and reduces both the material and the spiritual world into a series of loose, disconnected, and discrete sensations. His criticism against the law of causality reduces it to simply a psychological habit of expectation due to custom. So now, there is no way to connect present with the past or future impressions. So, given Locke's premises, there remains in the final conclusion nothing substantial, systematic, or necessary, but merely the fleeting impressions of the moment. Philosophy of Hume is the last word of empiricism. Here, reason is employed to show the weakness of reason, and reason is turned against itself. In An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, Hume declares himself to be a skeptic. A skeptic denies the very possibility of knowledge. It is an inquiry into the conditions of knowledge. Hume defined his skepticism as mitigated, or an academic skepticism. His skepticism is a developed form of Thoreau's uncompromising skepticism. Hume says that causal relation is only a product of imagination, a habit of expectation due to custom. There is no objective basis of this relation. It may be that, in the past, two events occurred repetitively, one after the other, yet there is no guarantee that in the future such correlation between two events will be observed. So, all our inferences regarding future events are uncertain, probable, and doubtful. All our knowledge regarding matters of fact is based on the relation of cause and effect. So, according to Hume, all our knowledge of matters of fact is uncertain and probable. But, though Hume is a skeptic regarding our knowledge of matters of fact, he admits our natural instinct towards the reality of external objects, even knowledge of matters of fact, as true. The water quenches our thirst, or consuming poison results in deaths. Fire burns, a dark cloud produces rain. These are all true, because doubting them is beneficial for our life. As Bertrand Russell puts it, if we believe that fire warms or it quenches, it is because it costs us too much pain to think otherwise. Hume says that he enjoys everything of this world, as a common man does. Yet in his philosophies, he does not believe in everything, but doubts in many well-accepted views. This is why Morris observed that Hume was less a skeptic than he thought himself to be. He never applied his skepticism against natural sciences, history, geography, sociology, algebra, arithmetic, mathematics, because the contradictory of this knowledge is not logically possible. He was a skeptic in his views regarding false metaphysics, which are discussions on supernatural, supersensible objects, like theology. As he himself observes, if we take in hand any volume of divinity or school of metaphysics, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quality or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matters of fact and existence? No. Commit it, then, to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. Hume was a skeptic, no doubt, but his skepticism was, as Copleston observes, a healthy antidote to dogmatism and fanaticism. Later philosophers in history or philosophy, like the logical positivists and phenomenalists, are very much indebted to Hume's straightforward scientific attitude towards philosophy. Kant, the greatest philosopher of modern times, observed that it is Hume who woke him from his dogmatic slumber. Hume's skepticism is inescapable for an empiricist. Hume, an intellectual biography. David Hume, who died in his native Edinburgh in 1776, has become something of a hero to academic philosophers. In 2009, he won first place in a large international poll of professors and graduate students who were asked to name the dead thinker with whom they most identified. The runners-up in this peculiar race were Aristotle and Kant. Hume beat them by a comfortable margin. Socrates only just made the top 20. This is quite a reversal of fortune for Hume, who failed in both of his attempts to get an academic job. In his own day, and into the 19th century, his philosophical writings were generally seen as perverse and destructive. Their goal was to produce in the readers a complete distrust in his own faculties, according to the Encyclopaedia Britannica in 1815 to 1817. The best that could be said for Hume as a philosopher was that he provoked wiser thinkers to refute him in interesting ways. As a historian and essayist, though, Hume enjoyed almost immediate success. When James Boswell called him the greatest writer in Britain, this was in 1762, before Boswell transferred his allegiance to Dr. Johnson, he was thinking mainly of Hume's History of England, which remained popular for much of the 19th century. Hume, David, the historian, is how the British Library rather conservatively still catalogued him in the 1980s. Hume the philosopher did have his early admirers, but they had to be careful what they said about him. 6 months after Hume's death, one of his closest friends, Adam Smith, implicitly likened him to Socrates, which caused a scandal. Smith had recently published a controversial treatise on economics, The Wealth of Nations. Yet his eulogy of Hume, and especially his account of Hume's composure in the face of death, brought upon me 10 times more abuse than the very violent attack I had made upon the whole commercial system of Great Britain. In a published account of his visit to the expiring Hume, Smith reported that he had found him making jokes about the underworld and in good spirits, as usual. Thus died our most excellent and never to be forgotten friend. Upon the whole, I have always considered him, both in his lifetime and since his death, as approaching as nearly to the idea of a perfectly wise and virtuous man as perhaps the nature of human frailty will admit. Educated readers of the time will have heard in Smith's effusive words an echo of Plato's encomium on the death of Socrates. Such was the end of our comrade, who was, of all those we knew, the bravest and also the most wisest and most upright man. The problem was that Hume was widely known to have been some sort of an infidel. He was therefore clearly a reprehensible fellow, albeit a jovial one, and thus undeserving of a calm death, let alone of tacit comparisons to Socrates. As James Harris dryly notes in his fine new biography, Hume's private letters show that he was not very good at being serious about religion. His lack of piety and the decorously veiled attacks on theism in his published writings may play some part in his current academic popularity. Most professional philosophers today are atheists, 73% of them according to the 2009 survey. Perhaps Hume's cheerful wit and enjoyment of life also help him to make him a model for today's philosophers, who do not like to think of themselves as unduly serious when off-duty. When he lived in Paris in his early 50s, the famously equable and entertaining Hume was celebrated in the salons as Le Bon David. A plausible report in a London newspaper quoted him as declining his publisher's requests for further volumes of his profitable histories on the grounds that he was now too old, too fat, too lazy, and too rich. Still, it is probably in the rise of so-called naturalism in philosophy that best explains Hume's newfound appeal. Naturalism has several components, all of which were prominent in his work. Hume stressed the similarities between people and other animals. A century before Darwin's Descent of Man, he argued there is no great difference between the minds of humans and the minds of some creatures in zoos. Hume also anticipated Darwin in implying that certain mental traits function to aid reproduction. He treated religion as a natural phenomenon to be explained in psychological and historical terms, which tended to annoy the pious, and he argued that the study of the mind and of morals should be pursued by the same empirical methods that were starting to cast new light on the rest of nature. Philosophy, for Hume, was thus not fundamentally different from science. This outlook is much more common in our time than it was in his. Philosophers now regard Hume's account of reason not as a mischievous plot to undermine it, but as an attempt to explain how it works. As Harris puts the matter, he was developing an entirely new theory of rationality. Hume treats humans as clever animals whose beliefs about most things are based on custom, in the form of propensity to expect the future to resemble the past. A propensity, he argued, that is essential for the conduct of life, but cannot be provided with any sort of independent justification. This thesis has come to be known as the problem of induction, though Hume himself did not regard it as presenting much of a problem. He played up the importance of what he called experimental or probable reasoning in human knowledge, and played down the significance of mathematical and quasi-mathematical deductions. This was a considerable novelty after some 2,000 years in which philosophers, still enthralled by Greek geometry, had mostly done the opposite. Hume's emphasis on the sort of empirical and fallible beliefs that humans share with some lesser creatures was all too easily interpreted as a denigration of the powers of the human mind. Hume first advanced his new theory of rationality in a treatise of human nature, most of which was written by the time he was 26, and which was, he claimed, mapped out while he was still a teenager. When the treatise did not produce quite the philosophical revolution that he had been counting on, Hume blamed its failure mainly on the way he had expressed himself, not on the book's ideas. He then set out to find other ways to communicate them, and other literary projects to pursue. Hume's life may therefore seem to have been a drama in two very different acts. In the first, he had tried unsuccessfully to make his mark in philosophy. In the second, he produced lighter works in order to make money and become famous. Hume the philosopher thus became Hume the popular historian and essayist. But is that the best way to see his career? Did Hume dilute his ideas to make them more appealing to the habitués of coffee houses, as one of his 19th century editors sniffily suggested? And was it fair of another to claim that few men of letters have been at heart so vain and so greedy of fame? Harris's biography argues that there was more continuity and integrity to Hume's intellectual journey than such remarks suggest. A love of literature had always been his ruling passion, wrote Hume at the end of his life. And as Harris points out, literature was a broad concept in Hume's century. It covered the entire world of learning, including history, divinity, philosophy, and politics. Hume always saw himself as a man of letters, unconfined by any particular academic speciality, and the range of his interests was evident from the start. 18th century Scotland, with its 4 thriving universities and a plethora of discussion clubs, was the perfect place for such a polymath. Hume's treatise was conceived as a work in 5 parts, dealing with the understanding, the passions, morals, politics, and the arts, all of which were to be illuminated by a new empirical science of human nature. According to the young Hume, the reason why so little had been established in these branches of learning was that they had hitherto depended more upon invention than experience. Careful observation of how the mind actually works, of how thoughts and feelings arise and give rise to further thoughts and feelings, would provide a complete system built on a foundation almost entirely new, and the only one upon which they can stand with any security. The first 2 parts of Hume's treatise, dealing with the understanding and the passions, were published at the start of 1739, when he was 27, and were followed the next year by a third, dealing with morals. The parts on politics and the arts never appeared, because Hume soon judged the project to have been a failure. The treatise, he wrote in an autobiographical essay, fell dead-born from the press without reaching such distinction as to even excite a murmur from the zealots. This was an exaggeration. Not only had the treatise been fairly widely and promptly reviewed, but the zealots murmured against it loudly enough for him to issue an anonymous pamphlet defending it against various charges. These charges were, among other things, that the treatise advocated universal skepticism, and that it sapped the foundations of morality by denying the natural and essential difference between right and wrong, all of which sounded rather impious. Hume's response to the allegation of universal skepticism was that the author of the treatise, who, he had pretended was someone else, had meant only to abate the pride of mere human reasoners. He advocated modesty and humility with regard to the operations of our natural faculties. As for the foundations of morality, Hume anonymously protested that the author of the treatise had merely denied that the propositions of morality were of the same nature with the truths of mathematics and the abstract sciences. The book did not dispute the fact that there was a difference between right and wrong. Rather, it maintained that this difference reflects humanity's internal tastes and sentiments, which, according to Hume's pamphlet, ought not to be received as a shocking idea. David Hume's quotes. David Hume is one of the most famous empiricists. Following Newton, he has profoundly changed the way which we consider knowledge, which comes from experience, according to Hume. Here are a few quotes and thoughts to help in understanding his philosophy. Hume and human understanding. Man is a rational being, and as such it receives its food science and his own food. But the boundaries of human understanding are so narrow they cannot hope on this little appreciation for the extent and for the safety of its acquisitions. It is not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the world to the scratching of my finger. Hume and causality. The idea of cause and effect comes from the experience that informs us that such particular objects, in all past cases, are conjoined with others when we pass from the impression of an object to the idea of another. We are determined not by reason, but by custom, or principle of association. Hume and impressions. The perceptions which enter with the most force and violence, we can call them prints, and this term I understand all our sensations, passions, and emotions, as they make their first appearance in the soul. Beauty is not an intrinsic quality of things. It exists only in the mind of the beholder. Hume and ideas. By ideas, I mean the pictures driving impressions in thinking and reasoning. Such, for example, all the perceptions excited by this speech, with the exception only of those from the sight and touch, and with the exception of immediate pleasure or inconvenience it may cause. All our simple ideas in their first appearance are derived from simple impressions. Hume and the self-identity. The ego is a fictional idea. Hume and religion. The belief is nothing but a design of an object more vivid, more alive, stronger, firmer, more stable than the imagination alone is ever able to get. Hume and passions. Passion is a primitive existence, or, if you will, a primitive mode of existence. Science quotes by David Hume. That the sun will not rise tomorrow is no less intelligible a proposition and implies no more contradiction than the affirmation that it will rise. We should, in vain, therefore, attempt to demonstrate its falsehood. A miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and as a firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle, from the very nature of the fact, is entirely as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. Why is it more than probable that all men must die, that lead cannot, of itself, remain suspended in the air, that fire consumes wood, and is extinguished by water, unless it be that these events are found agreeable to the laws of nature, and that there is required a violation of these laws, or in other words, a miracle, to prevent them? Nothing is more esteemed than a miracle, if it ever happens in the common course of nature. There must, therefore, be a uniform experience against every miraculous event, otherwise the event would not merit the appellation. And as a uniform experience amounts to a proof, there is here a direct and full proof from the nature of a fact against the existence of any miracle, nor can such a proof be destroyed, or the miracle rendered credible by but an opposite proof, which is superior. All knowledge resolves itself into probability. In every judgment which we can form concerning probability as well as concerning knowledge, we ought always to correct the first judgment derived from the nature of the object by another judgment derived from the nature of understanding. All the sciences have a relation, greater or less, to human nature, and, however wide any of them may seem to run from it, they still return back by one passage or another. Even mathematics, natural philosophy, and natural religion are in some measure dependent on the science of man, since they lie under the cognizance of men, and are judged of by their powers and faculties. Be a philosopher, but amidst all your philosophies, be still a man. But the life of man is of no greater importance to the universe than that of an oyster. Generally speaking, the errors in religion are dangerous, those in philosophy only ridiculous. If the past may be no rule for the future, all experience becomes useless and can give rise to no inferences or conclusions. If we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. In all matters of opinion and science, the difference between men is often found to lie in generals rather than particulars, and to be less in reality than in appearance. An explication of the terms commonly ends the controversy, and the disputants are surprised to find that they had been quarrelling, while at the bottom they agreed in their judgment. In reality, all arguments from experience are founded on the similarity which we discover among natural objects, and by which we are induced to expect effects similar to those which we have found to follow through from such objects. And though none but a fool or a madman will ever pretend to dispute the authority of experience, or to reject that great guide of human life, it may surely be allowed a philosopher to have so much curiosity at least as to examine the principle of human nature, which gives this mighty authority to experience, and makes us draw advantage from that similarity which nature has placed among objects. From causes which appear similar, we expect similar effects. This is the sum of our experimental conclusions. It must, however, be confessed that this species of skepticism, when more moderate, may be understood in a very reasonable sense, and is a necessary preparative to the study of philosophy, by preserving a proper impartiality in our judgments, and weaning our mind from all those prejudices which we may have imbibed from education or rash opinion. It seems to me that the only object of the abstract sciences, or of demonstration, is quantity and number, and that all attempts to extend this more perfect species of knowledge beyond these bounds are mere sophistry and illusion. Look round the world, contemplate the whole and every part of it. You will find it to be nothing but one great machine, subdivided into an infinite number of lesser machines, which again admit of subdivisions to a degree beyond what the human senses and faculties can trace and explain. All these various machines, and even their most minute parts, are adjusted to each other with an accuracy which ravishes into admiration all men who have ever contemplated them. The curious adapting of means to ends throughout all nature resembles exactly, though it much exceeds, the productions of human contrivance, of human design, thought, wisdom, and intelligence. Look round this universe. What an immense profusion of beings, animated and organized, sensible and active! You admire this prodigious variety and fecundity. But inspect a little more narrowly these living existences, the only being worth regarding. How hostile and destructive to each other! How insufficient, all of them, for their own happiness! How contemptible or odious to the spectator! The whole presents nothing but the idea of a blind nature, impregnated by a great vivifying principle, and pouring forth from her lap, without discernment or parental care, her maimed and abortive children. Reason is, and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. The anatomist presents to eye the most hideous and disagreeable objects, but his science is useful to the painter in delineating even a Venus or a Helen. The sweetest and most inoffensive path of life leads through avenues of science and learning, and whoever can remove any obstruction in his way or open up any new prospect ought, so far, to be esteemed a benefactor to mankind. There is nothing in itself valuable or despicable, desirable or hateful, beautiful or deformed, but that these attributes arise from the particular constitution and fabric of human sentiment and affection. Though there be no such thing as chance in the world, our ignorance of the real cause of any event has the same influence on the understanding and begets a like species of belief or opinion. This evidence that all reasoning concerning matter of fact are founded on the relation of cause and effect, and that we can never infer the existence of one object from another unless they be connected together, either mediately or immediately. Here is a billiard ball lying on the table, and another ball moving toward it with rapidity. They strike, and the ball which was formerly at rest now acquires a motion. This is as perfect an instance of relation of cause and effect as any which we can know, either by sensation or reflection. To consider the most aright, reason is nothing but a wonderful and unintelligible instinct in our souls, which carries us along a certain train of ideas and endows them with particular qualities, according to their particular situations and relations. This instinct, 'tis true, arises from past observation and experience, but can anyone give the ultimate reason why past experience and observation produces such an effect, any more than why nature alone should produce it? We have no other notion of cause and effect, but that of certain objects which have always conjoined together, and which, in all past instances, have been found inseparable. We cannot penetrate into the reason of the conjunction. We only observe the thing itself, and always find that from the constant conjunction the objects acquire a union in the imagination. We need only reflect on what has been proved at large, that we are never sensible of any connection between causes and effects, and that 'tis only by our experience of their constant conjunction we can arrive at any knowledge of this relation. What is possible can never be demonstrated to be false, and 'tis possible the course of nature may change, since we can conceive such a change. Nay, I will go further and assert that he could not so much as prove by any probable arguments that the future must be conformable to the past. All probable arguments are built on supposition that there is conformity betwixt the future and the past, and therefore can never prove it. This conformity is a matter of fact, and if it must be proved, will admit of no proof but from experience. But our experience in the past can be a proof of nothing for the future, but upon a supposition that there is a resemblance betwixt them. This, therefore, is a point which can admit of no proof at all, and which we take for granted without any proof. While Newton seemed to draw off the veil from some of the mysteries of nature, he showed, at the same time, the imperfections of mechanical philosophy, and thereby restored her ultimate secrets to that obscurity in which they ever did and ever will remain. This has been David Hume, Understanding His Philosophical Works and Life. Written by Ferdinand Gives. Narrated by Alistair Cunningham. Copyright 2018 by Ferdinand Gives. Production copyright 2018 by Ferdinand Gives.
This has been Chinese Mythology, a concise guide to the gods, heroes, sagas, rituals, and beliefs of Chinese myths. Written by Bernard Hayes. Narrated by Zachary Dillon Brown. Copyright 2018 by Bernard Hayes. Production copyright 2018 by Bernard Hayes.